As I pulled into the driveway, a strange sensation washed over me, a gut instinct telling me that something was off. Jessica's car was in its usual spot, but another vehicle, a sleek black sedan, was parked in front of the house. I dismissed it at first, thinking maybe one of her friends had dropped by for coffee. But as I reached for the door handle, my mind raced with a series of small observations I'd overlooked over the past few months. Her late nights, her sudden laughter that wasn't meant for me, and the way she'd started closing her laptop whenever I walked into the room. I pushed the thoughts aside. This was supposed to be a surprise. I'd just wrapped up a business trip, where I'd secretly booked us an anniversary getaway to the Bahamas. I hadn't told her about it yet. I wanted to see her face light up when I revealed the tickets. But as I stepped into the quiet house, an unusual tension filled the air. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of laughter coming from upstairs. Jessica's laugh, warm and familiar. But there was something different about it, a lightness that hadn't been there for months. And mingling with her voice was a man's, a deep, rumbling voice I didn't recognize. I froze, gripping the stair railing, my heart racing in my chest. Maybe it was nothing. Her brother, perhaps, or an old friend who had stopped by. But with each step I took, the voices became clearer, the laughter more intimate. When I reached the top of the stairs, the bedroom door was slightly ajar, giving me a glimpse into the room where I had spent so many nights by her side. Inside, Jessica was sprawled across the bed, half covered by sheets, her head tilted back in laughter. Beside her lay a man, shirtless, his arm casually draped across her waist. My heart clenched, the weight of my shattered world settling heavily on my shoulders. I felt the crinkle of the plane tickets in my pocket, their promise of rekindled romance now a cruel mockery of the life we'd once shared. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to make them understand the depth of the betrayal I felt in that moment. But something in me hesitated. Instead, I quietly retreated down the stairs, my mind reeling. In the kitchen, I collapsed into a chair, the tickets slipping from my fingers as I struggled to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of infidelity. The laughter, the intimacy. They spoke of a familiarity that came with time, with countless shared secrets and stolen glances. How long had this been going on? My hands shook as I reached for my phone, pulling up our text messages, scrolling through weeks of mundane exchanges that suddenly felt like lies. As I scrolled, memories surfaced, moments when Jessica had seemed distant, distracted. I'd brushed it off as stress, assuming it was work or the demands of daily life. Now, each of those moments replayed in my mind, each one a clue I'd missed, a sign I'd ignored. The laughter from upstairs faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps. They were moving around, likely getting dressed, oblivious to the turmoil unfolding downstairs. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but a part of me knew that nothing she could say would change what I'd just seen. I walked out into the crisp evening air, my mind still numb. Standing in the driveway, I glanced back at the house, the place that had once been my sanctuary, now tainted by the shadow of betrayal. I stood there, staring up at the darkened window, memories flickering through my mind like scenes from a life I'd never actually lived. Had it all been an illusion, built on trust that had turned to ash? The house I once cherished felt as foreign as a stranger's. I glanced down at the crumpled tickets in my hand, thinking of the anniversary trip I'd planned, now just a reminder of my own foolishness. But as much as I wanted to leave, to turn my back and forget this place forever, something held me there. A need for answers, perhaps, or maybe a desire for justice. The whispers of suspicion that had crept in over the past few months demanded more than blind rage. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Not yet. I took a deep breath and forced myself back into the house, letting the door close softly behind me. I didn't go back upstairs. Instead, I headed for Jessica's laptop on the kitchen counter. It was closed but not locked, something she'd started doing only recently. I lifted the lid, watching as the screen came to life. For a moment, I felt like an intruder in my own home. But the anger welling up inside me made it easier to push past the guilt. I searched through her emails, her social media, anything that might give me a clue. Then I saw it. an email chain from her best friend, Mia, with the subject line, "Keeping your secret safe." I clicked it open. Jessica's replies were cautious but unmistakably candid. I read line after line of confessions she'd shared with Mia, how she'd felt unfulfilled in our marriage, how she'd met someone new who understood her, and how she was scared but excited. I felt my stomach churn as I read words that painted me as an inattentive, clueless husband. There was even talk of Jessica considering a fresh start, and the implications hit like a punch to the gut. I'd poured everything into this marriage, and here she was, discussing her exit plan with her friend. I needed more. I wanted to know every detail. In her text messages, I finally found him, Evan. There were no mushy exchanges or obvious declarations of love, but it was all there in the brevity, in the way she responded to him almost instantly, the way she used emojis she'd never used with me. My fingers scrolled through the endless texts, noting each time they'd planned to meet up, each carefully orchestrated excuse that she delivered to me with a straight face. It was a timeline of their betrayal, and I realized just how long this had been going on. Months, at least. I read further, and as I did, something unexpected surfaced, turning my stomach from anger to cold dread. Their exchanges hinted at something bigger, an inheritance. My inheritance, to be exact. Jessica had mentioned to Evan that soon the money would come through, and that she'd be set for life. She must have known that I was set to receive a significant payout from my father's trust, but I'd been waiting until our anniversary to tell her. I realized then she'd been biding her time. She'd been playing the role of the faithful wife just long enough to secure her place in the estate. I had to sit down, processing this new layer of her deception. The trip to the Bahamas, plans for the future, all of it, suddenly, took on a more sinister context. I was just a pawn in her scheme. I wanted to confront her, to make her see the damage she'd caused, but a colder, more calculated voice inside told me to wait. An idea was forming. If she wanted a fresh start so badly, I'd give her one, but on my terms. Over the next week, I became an actor in my own life, pretending everything was normal. Jessica didn't seem to suspect a thing. I could feel myself growing detached, each morning's "goodbye, honey," and each evening's "how was your day?" feeling less like real conversations and more like lines from a script. At night, when she thought I was sleeping, she'd sneak off to the bathroom to check her phone, probably texting Evan, keeping up their fantasy of a new life. I put my own plan into motion quietly. I reached out to my lawyer, having him draw up a new will that would freeze any assets under Jessica's name. I wanted to make sure that if she thought she could walk away with half my money, she was sorely mistaken. I then arranged to meet with my accountant to shift my inheritance into a trust that would be locked from any marital claims. The lawyer assured me that this move would protect my assets. I was ensuring that she'd be left with nothing but the memories of her betrayal. Next, I decided to bring in someone who could provide me the one thing I couldn't gather on my own: evidence. I hired a private investigator named Rick, an old friend from college. I knew that Rick would be discreet, and that he'd know exactly where to look. Rick set up small cameras around the house, one she'd never notice, in the kitchen, in our home office, even in the bedroom. I hated to invade what little privacy we had left, but this wasn't about dignity. It was about justice. It didn't take long for the cameras to catch what I needed. I watched in real time as Jessica snuck a second phone out from the vent above our bed, casually texting Evan even while she lay beside me. She was bold, almost careless, and it stung knowing that she had no respect left for me. The footage Rick provided also confirmed my suspicions about the inheritance. She'd been discussing it with Evan like they were planning their lives around it, almost treating me like an obstacle they'd soon be rid of. But the last piece of evidence hit the hardest. One afternoon, while I was at work, Jessica invited him over. Evan, the man I'd only seen in blurry photos from Rick's surveillance footage, sat comfortably on my couch, my wife by his side, laughing, talking about their future. They didn't even hide their plans. Evan leaned in close, saying, "Once he transfers the inheritance, you'll be set. Then it's just us, baby. Just us." The words sliced through me, but at the same time, I felt a calm clarity. They were already living in a world where I was gone, and they'd become arrogant, assuming I'd never catch on. The night before our anniversary, I decided it was time. Jessica thought I was away on a last-minute business trip, but I was close by, waiting for the perfect moment. After she texted me goodnight, I let myself into the house and crept into the room where I knew she and Evan were sleeping. I watched them in silence, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fury and detachment. I took out my phone and filmed them, the evidence I knew would finalize everything. In the morning, before she even woke, I left a note beside her on the bed. "Happy anniversary. Here's to your fresh start." I left the note on her pillow, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The truth was out, and I was free to walk away from the weight of her lies. As I quietly slipped out of the house, a sense of calm settled over me. It was the calm of a man who'd walked through the fire and was finally emerging on the other side. My lawyer had helped me prepare everything. By the time Jessica woke up and read that note, I'd be at my bank, moving every last cent of my inheritance into an untouchable account. My new will was already in effect, freezing all joint assets. The accounts would be inaccessible to her, and soon enough, she'd be left without a dime to her name. But I wasn't finished yet. I knew she would try to call, so I blocked her number and left my phone with Rick. By the time she managed to track me down, I'd be long gone, and she'd be facing the consequences of her choices. Sure enough, my lawyer called me later that afternoon with an update. Jessica had tried to access the joint accounts, only to be met with a message that the funds were frozen. Her attempts to withdraw money from my inheritance had failed, and she was now frantically calling every number she had for me. Rick told me she was leaving messages filled with panic, anger, and confusion. And then, as if on cue, Rick's last bit of surveillance footage came through on my laptop. There, captured on the grainy footage, was Jessica, sobbing as she dialed Evan's number. "Evan, he's cut me off," she stammered, wiping away tears. "He froze everything. The money's gone, all of it. He left a note, he knows." Evan's response was as cold as I expected. "You're kidding me. I thought you said he was clueless," he scoffed, clearly more annoyed than concerned. "You had one job, Jessica. One job, to keep things quiet until you got your hands on that money. You told me you could handle it. Evan, I didn't think he'd catch on. He was supposed to be gone. He never even cared about those accounts before," she cried, her voice breaking. Evan paused, clearly irritated. "Look, I'm not going to get involved in your mess. If the money's gone, there's no reason for me to stick around." He hung up before she could protest. I watched as her face fell, her entire world crumbling around her. She sank onto the bed, defeated, staring at the empty room around her. She was alone now, just like she'd planned for me. In the weeks that followed, Jessica attempted to reach out to me through family, friends, even mutual acquaintances. I received emails filled with apologies, desperate pleas, even a few threats. She went from blaming me to begging me for forgiveness, promising that it had all been a mistake and that she didn't mean it. But I had nothing left to say to her. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. I moved to a new town, taking up a position at a firm that had been trying to recruit me for years. I bought a small, quiet house on a lake where I could be alone with my thoughts and finally start over. And though the memories of Jessica's betrayal haunted me, they also taught me to appreciate the freedom I'd regained. For too long, I'd lived under the illusion that I was building a life with someone who cared for me, only to discover that she'd been using me all along. But now, I was free to pursue my own happiness, unburdened by the weight of her lies. A year later, on the anniversary of our divorce, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Jessica. I almost threw it away, but something made me open it. Inside was a single page, filled with hastily written words. "I know I've lost you, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I made a mistake, a horrible, selfish mistake. Evan was a mistake. Please forgive me. I'm lost without you." I stared at the letter, feeling nothing but a cold detachment. Jessica had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside, realizing that I no longer felt the rage or heartbreak that had once consumed me. In the end, I walked away without looking back. Jessica had her fresh start, and so did I, just not the way she'd imagined. The letter remained on my table, a reminder of a life I no longer recognized as my own. Jessica's words, filled with regret and apologies, were echoes of a past I'd left behind. And yet, as much as I'd convinced myself I'd moved on, I couldn't deny the emptiness that lingered, gnawing at me in the quiet hours of the night. My new life had all the markers of freedom: a quiet house by the lake, a new job where no one knew my history, even new friends who had no idea about the betrayal that had driven me here. But solitude had its price, and sometimes it felt like I'd traded one prison for another, this time with walls of loneliness and unresolved pain. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts one rainy evening as I sat staring out over the lake. I opened the door, surprised to see Rick standing there, drenched from the storm. He held a manila envelope, a serious expression clouding his face. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing me the envelope. Inside were printouts of emails, documents, and photos. They were messages between Jessica and Evan, stretching back nearly 2 years. I skimmed through them, horrified by the depth of their manipulation. Evan had been coaching her, guiding her through every step: how to keep her suspicions of me under control, how to deflect my questions, and how to make me believe in her love even while she was planning her exit. The pictures showed them together in places I recognized: our favorite restaurant, a hotel we'd once stayed in, places where Jessica and I had made memories together, now tainted. But the real bombshell was buried halfway through the stack: a bank statement in Jessica's name, showing a recent deposit of an alarmingly large amount of money from an account I didn't recognize. I looked up at Rick, puzzled. "It's Evan's," Rick said, his face unreadable. "He's been wiring money to her for months. Not just from his savings, either. It looks like he's been skimming it off some shady deals. And here's the kicker: they were planning to run. Not just from you, but from a handful of people looking to find Evan for his, let's call it, financial misconduct." So, she was more than just cheating. She was in on his schemes? Rick nodded. "Looks like she was ready to take off with him as soon as they thought they had enough. But when you froze the accounts, Evan probably panicked and cut his losses." He hesitated. "And there's something else. Evan's got a record, Alex. Fraud, embezzlement, you name it. But worse, he's connected to some people who aren't the type to let someone double-cross them and walk away." It hit me like a freight train. Jessica hadn't just betrayed me. She'd gotten herself entangled with someone dangerous, all for a quick escape and an easier life. And now, it seemed, she was paying for it in ways she'd never anticipated. Days passed, and as I tried to digest the revelations, Jessica's calls began again. She must have sensed that the walls were closing in around her, and I realized she was reaching out not just to me, but to nearly everyone in her old life. And then, one day, she showed up at my door. I hadn't heard her car on the gravel, and it wasn't until I opened the door to head into town that I found her, standing on my porch in the rain. She was a shadow of her former self, her once confident smile replaced by a desperate, almost pleading look. "Alex," she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know where else to go. I wanted to slam the door in her face, to let her stand there in the rain with her decisions. But her vulnerability was disarming. Against my better judgment, I let her in, standing aside as she crossed the threshold. Once inside, Jessica took a shaky breath, struggling to meet my gaze. "I know I don't deserve this. I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm scared, Alex. Evan, he's not who I thought he was. He's in trouble, and now he's dragging me into it." I felt a mixture of anger and pity rise in me. This was the woman who had dismantled my life piece by piece, and now she wanted my help. "You expect me to help you after everything you did?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't flinch. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I have nowhere else to turn. Evan's gone off the rails, and the people he was involved with, they know about me. I thought I could get away clean, that he'd protect me, but I was wrong." She looked at me, desperate. "Please, Alex, I know you have every reason to hate me, but if you ever loved me at all, you'll help me." I almost laughed at the irony. She had used my love for her to justify betraying me, and now she was appealing to it again. But beneath her fear, I saw something else: remorse. Real remorse, not the contrived, manipulative words I'd seen in her emails. It was as if the Jessica I'd once known, the woman I'd fallen in love with, was resurfacing, just barely visible beneath the wreckage of her choices. Reluctantly, I agreed to help, but on my terms. I wasn't going to welcome her back with open arms. Instead, I would help her find a safe place, far from Evan, far from the mess she'd entangled herself in. I couldn't abandon her completely, not when she was clearly terrified and alone. But I made it clear, this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about closure. We worked together to move her to a small town, hours away from anyone who knew her. I arranged a place for her to stay and helped her set up the legal protection she'd need if Evan came looking for her. She thanked me endlessly, but I remained distant, firm in my resolve not to let her back into my life. But as I drove away, leaving her behind in a town she didn't recognize, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt empty, as though a part of me had finally died. The woman I had loved, the life I had once cherished, had been left behind in that rainy little town. A bittersweet chapter closed at last. Back at home, I settled into the quiet life I'd built, and gradually, the memories of Jessica faded. There were no more unexpected knocks on the door, no more desperate calls. I began to feel like myself again, more sure of who I was than ever before. And then, one evening, months later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a letter written in a careful, almost fragile hand. Alex, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted you to know that I found a job here. I'm trying to make something of my life again, trying to be the person you once loved. I know I can never undo what I did, but I hope you find peace knowing that I'm finally facing my mistakes. I will never forget the kindness you showed me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you, Jessica. As I read her words, I realized that, somehow, I had found peace too. In helping her, I had finally put an end to the cycle of anger and regret. I folded the letter, placing it in a box of memories from my past life, feeling a strange sense of relief. Jessica had moved on, just as I had. But the betrayal had taught me something more valuable than I'd ever realized: how to love myself again. I placed Jessica's letter back in the box, feeling the weight of unfinished business settle over me. The peace I'd felt reading her words had been temporary, a fleeting distraction from the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Jessica was out of my life, yes, but the scars she'd left lingered. And then there was Evan, that slick, dangerous man who'd entered my life only to tear it apart. He was still out there, likely roaming free, with no idea that I'd spent sleepless nights planning the kind of revenge he wouldn't see coming. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't undo what they'd done to me, but I could make sure they both faced the consequences. It took me weeks to set everything in motion. First, I called Rick, the one person I could count on to help me dig deeper without asking questions. I asked him to find out every possible detail about Evan, his connections, his hideouts, his weaknesses. By the end of the week, Rick delivered a thick file to my door, his expression unreadable as he handed it over. "You sure about this, Alex?" he asked, his voice low. "Absolutely," I replied. "He didn't just take Jessica from me. He tried to take my entire life. I'm not letting that slide." Inside the file, I found details that painted a very different picture of the man Jessica had risked everything for. Evan had a history of fraud, embezzlement, and financial schemes that had ruined countless lives. But his last deal had gone south. He'd conned the wrong people, and they were hunting for him. It was a perfect opportunity, one I couldn't pass up. The next phase was simple but risky. I took the information Rick had gathered, including Evan's shady deals, and crafted an anonymous tip. I sent it to a select few of Evan's former associates, men who had no qualms about taking matters into their own hands. It didn't take long before I started hearing murmurs that Evan was on the run, scrambling to cover his tracks as his former partners came after him. But that was just the beginning. I dug deeper into his finances, finding small pockets of hidden money scattered in offshore accounts that he'd been siphoning off for years. Using some connections from my work in finance, I orchestrated a small but effective hack, draining those accounts little by little and redirecting the funds to charities, the same way he'd stolen from others. I knew he'd be furious, scrambling to figure out who was behind it, But by then he'd be too busy running to even guess it was me. Then came the final piece, the message I sent to Jessica. I knew she'd still be in that small town, far from her old life and left to pick up the pieces. I crafted the letter carefully, making sure it hit exactly the right nerve. Jessica, it's ironic, isn't it? You ran off with Evan, believing he was your ticket to happiness, yet here you are, alone and scared. I want you to know that Evan is out there, trying to stay one step ahead of men who know exactly what he did. I suggest you watch your back, because soon, he'll have nowhere left to run. This isn't a threat, it's a warning. You chose to betray me, but I'm giving you the chance to protect yourself. Don't waste it. I knew the message would hit her like a punch to the gut, fueling a paranoia that would keep her looking over her shoulder, second-guessing every stranger who approached her. The Jessica I knew was clever, but not cunning, and the thought of her living in constant fear, uncertain of where the next danger might come from, was a fitting end. Days passed, then weeks. I heard whispers that Evan had been sighted, desperate and on the move. But it was a message from Rick that confirmed my plan's success. Got a call from one of my sources, Rick said over the phone. Evan's in a rough spot. Word is he's living on borrowed time. And the people after him, well, let's just say they don't play nice. I closed my eyes, feeling a strange satisfaction settle over me. Evan was exactly where he deserved to be, cornered, desperate, and abandoned by the woman he'd convinced to betray me. It was the revenge I hadn't known I'd needed, and yet it brought a finality that I hadn't expected. He would never know who had orchestrated it all, and that was the best part. He'd be left wondering until his final moment if it was Jessica, one of his former partners, or just the universe finally setting things right. Weeks later, I received a single, final letter from Jessica, postmarked from a distant town. Alex, I don't know what happened, but Evan, he's gone. I heard rumors that he's hiding, or worse. And I just know that somehow, you were involved. I don't blame you. I don't think I ever could. You were always better than me, and even now, knowing you've had your revenge, I can't hate you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I understand if you'll never respond to this letter. But please, know that I loved you once. I'll spend the rest of my life remembering that. I read the letter and let it sit in my hands for a long time before finally setting it aside. I'd achieved my revenge, but more than that, I'd found my closure. And though the memories of her betrayal would never fully fade, I knew they no longer held the same power over me. Jessica had made her choice, and so had I. Now, finally, it was over. Weeks passed after Jessica's last letter, and I began to feel like a different man. The weight of betrayal had lifted, and a newfound peace had settled over me. For the first time, I was living in the present, unburdened by the ghosts of my past. But just as I started to rebuild, fate had one final twist in store. One cold autumn night, just as I was settling into my evening routine, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of caution ran through me. Peering through the window, I saw a familiar silhouette, the hunched shoulders, the downcast eyes. It was Jessica. I opened the door reluctantly. She stood there, drenched and trembling in the pouring rain, looking even more broken than the last time I'd seen her. Without a word, I gestured for her to come inside, and she stepped over the threshold, her gaze never quite meeting mine. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I had nowhere else to go. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, all the memories, the laughter, the shared dreams, even the betrayal, rushed back. Part of me wanted to close the door on her for good, to tell her she'd made her bed and now she had to lie in it. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I'd once loved, stopped me. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Jessica took a deep, shuddering breath. "Evan's gone. Really gone. I tried to leave him, to disappear, but I think he found out that I'd reached out to you. He vanished after that, leaving me with nothing." She swallowed hard, her eyes filling with desperation. "I don't have anyone else, Alex. I don't have anywhere else to go." I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Here she was, the woman who'd once shared my life, now reduced to begging for shelter. I wanted to feel triumphant, to relish the irony. But instead, I just felt tired. You betrayed me, Jessica, I said softly, watching as my words sliced through her. You betrayed everything we had, for a man who left you in the cold. I know, she whispered, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I didn't know who else would understand. I hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. And then, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I invited her to stay for one night. Just one night. We sat in silence, the tension between us like a tightly wound coil. And as I watched her across the room, I realized that maybe this wasn't about forgiveness. Maybe this was about ending things properly, so I could finally walk away without a trace of regret. The next morning, Jessica looked even more fragile than before. She'd spent the night curled up on the couch, staring into space as though haunted by 1,000 invisible demons. As dawn broke, she stood, clearly waiting for me to say something. I poured us both a coffee, the silence between us oddly peaceful. For once, there was no need for excuses, no more lies. Just two people who'd once been in love, facing the wreckage they'd created. Jessica, I started, choosing my words carefully. Why did you come back? Was it really Evan's betrayal, or was it something else? She sighed, her gaze drifting out the window. I came back because you were the only real thing I had, Alex. Everything else was a lie. I lost myself trying to find happiness, and when Evan left, I realized I'd been chasing something empty, something shallow. I nodded, absorbing her words. For the first time, I saw Jessica as she really was, a flawed, broken person who had made choices she couldn't take back. But that didn't mean I owed her forgiveness. I can't pretend everything's okay, I said slowly. You destroyed what we had, and you can't just rebuild that. You'll have to rebuild yourself, Jessica, somewhere else, far from here. She met my eyes, her expression one of quiet understanding. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Alex. Not just for last night, but for everything you gave me, even if I didn't deserve it. She turned to leave, her silhouette framed in the doorway as the morning sun streamed in. I watched as she walked away, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. And with each step she took, a weight lifted from my chest, leaving only the quiet promise of freedom. As I closed the door behind her, I felt the final piece of closure I'd been seeking. There would be no more letters, no more pleas for forgiveness. This was the end, the clean break I'd needed to move forward. I stood there in the silence of my home, no longer haunted by her memory. Jessica was gone for good, and for the first time, I felt truly free. The past was behind me, and a new life awaited. As I took a deep breath, I realized that the revenge I'd planned so meticulously had given me something I hadn't expected: peace. And with that, I walked forward, ready to embrace the life that was waiting for me on the other side. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Tell us, what would you have done in their shoes?